I mean, this is also what I find so productive with the using coercion as a lens of analysis, because it's not only between the dominating and the dominated, the colonizer and the colonized, or the master and the slave, but it's, coercive dynamics are at play also when you see Venice needs to nourish its growing population, and the master can fall into fears because he doesn't feel safe at home, and it's more complex than just saying master slave, colonizer colonized. These dichotomies we have learned to think and write and analyze the world.
This is Juliane Schiel, professor at the Department of Social and Economic History at the University of Vienna.
I am a medievalist and early modernist, working mainly on the history of Venice and the Western Mediterranean. And there, as a social and economic historian, I'm mainly interested in social settings of power relations. And in that in particular, I study the lives and the practices of slaves, slaving practices, slave trade, and which role, which social place they had in the Venetian society.
Today's key term, coercion, essentially describes the act of getting someone to do something that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise do. It has a really broad application, from general social pressures to outright force, and there is a lot of discussion on how or where the word coercion actually fits. In the case of slavery and labor coercion, we can imagine things like debt, byproducts of war, or consequences of a criminal court case. Juliane Schiel's project is located in the Eurasian Transformation's Geographies of Power node. It addresses resource accumulation and labor coercion in imperial societies of Eurasia through the lens of urban and rural household economies. They're trying to understand the social power dynamics of male-dominated societies in the Mediterranean world and Asia from the Bronze Age to the early modern period by taking a closer look at the people who worked, who served. The ancient portion of this project focuses from around the 21st to the 5th century BCE to the early modern period around the 13th to 18th century CE. It's helpful to break this huge undertaking into categories like regions, time periods, to find a joint lens of analysis. The question is, how can you even begin to compare societies as different as these?
I come a lot from labor history, especially from global labor history, and there for many years has been this opposition between Marxist labor historians and liberal historians. And they have been discussing dividing societies and labor relations into free and unfree labor, and then classified this is a wage laborer, this is a slave, etc. So all kinds of labor relations. And leaving those categories behind and looking at sets of labor relations and of power relations that are at stake is much more productive in its way to connect with other societies and other time periods across time and space. So Michael Josa, my colleague with whom I work closest together, working on ancient Mesopotamian societies, and me working on late medieval Venice. How should we, besides just setting one case next to each other's, how can we actually bring them into a dialogue? And our entry point here is to look on a micro scale, but make it comparable. We decided to focus on household dynamics, as assuming that the household is somehow the smallest social unit you can study to understand power relations from a micro base, and then deduce and try to link it to broader dynamics. And here, what we thought was most productive is to study the relations between kin and non-kin household members and understand household in a wider sense.
What that means is that it doesn't just concern the core family, but the people who work, who are forming the economic unit. That is the household. And that cannot just be a household in a city. It can mean a countryside manor. It can mean a monastery, anywhere, not just under one roof. Before we get into the details, why coercion?
When we study Eurasian empires, empires that rise, empires that shrink, that are successful and are not successful, then it's mainly always about resource accumulation and about the mobilization of labor force. And these two always go together. So the imperial side needs to be successful in accumulating resources, all kind of, can be silver, can also be grain, can be anything. But for being successful in accumulating resources, you also need to mobilize labor force for yourself.
When I asked what we're talking about when we speak of coercion, she told me that it's important to never take an academic term and put it on a historical phenomenon. Instead, we should let the sources speak for themselves and tend to map the vocabulary of the negotiation of power relations from there. Some of the sources that are easiest to connect across disciplines and time periods, she told me, are juridical documents. Because if you have a written culture, you're going to have documentation of people fighting about the right way to look at things. Legal and illegal violence, norms that are set or violated. This type of source makes reading side by side across time and space surprisingly easy. So far, this has been quite theoretical, so let's consider some examples. When studying microhistories, you start with a specific case and then contextualize it, seeing what you can induce for the broader, more abstract level. This next section is about something that happened in Renaissance Venice of 1410, but had a much longer lasting consequence.
One that is particularly interesting is a case where a slave woman, was accused of poisoning her master. And you learn through the case how it is described by the scribes, that she was found pregnant by her master, and her master got very angry and hit her almost to death. So she was really heavily hit. She lost her baby, and then she took revenge. And she went to a pharmacist and bought arsene to poison her master, and he died. Now, unluckily for her, it was one of the highest Venetian noblemen. It was the son of the Proveditore di San Marco, so it's the one under the Doge. And that had a huge effect on, within the noble Venetian society, on how to deal with the slaves as household members, as someone who lives very close, and how do we control them, or are they also a danger? And how can we protect against them? And that initiated a whole series of legislation on how to regulate the selling of poisonous ingredients in pharmacies. And also then a whole discussion on professional medicine and popular medicine. Because then we have more and more cases of slave women poisoning or trying to poison in the upcoming years.
It wasn't that suddenly slaves were poisoning more often than they did before, but there was a fear around the topic, a sensitivity for a danger that the masters couldn't control and couldn't protect themselves enough from.
And the repressive mechanisms that then took place also against any kind of popular female medicine. From then in the stories you can read, and the accused slave actually went to a neighboring popular woman who had some knowledge in popular medicine and helped her with creating their own thing to poisoning their masters.
This then meshes with many other issues that come up in society with these unequal power relations. It leads to the pharmacist becoming a much more professionalized occupation. First, only nobles become pharmacists, and then they also need to have a diploma, which only men can receive, and then the poisoning ingredients can only be sold by 2 big pharmacies in the city. It leads to women who had knowledge in medicine but no diploma, midwives. They all were more and more at the risk of being criminalized.
It's not only this one woman that initiated all this, but it's like a seismograph.
My conversation with Juliane Schiel was much longer than this, going into another huge example on Venetian agricultural laborers and the history of Venice's colonization of the island of Crete in the 13th century. We also spoke about the structure of our research project, the cluster, and what her project aims to achieve, something we might come back to in another video, as this one was getting a little long. For now, I'm so happy that you joined me for this fascinating look into labor and power relations, and I hope you'll be back next time. While you think about whether to like and subscribe, I'll leave you with this.
For me, what is important is always that you study something very specific and you try to do justice to the historical context of the source you have. But then stepping back from it and see what is actually the pattern and the dynamics you can learn from, or you can actually identify on a more abstract level, then of course it's even up for today's crazy world, something that can help us a lot. It's all about resource accumulation. When we think about energy, oil, and then who does the labor for AI today? Where does do the resources and where do the labor forces come from, and who wins over all this?